Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everyone. I love that this podcast is heard by people all over the world, and I love that we get to follow and track where it's being listened to, sometimes down to the cities in certain states and certain countries, and sometimes countries that I didn't realize had a great listenership and had a following there. And as always, please let me know what is bringing listeners to the podcast in your part of the world. We really like to learn about what's happening, because if there are things happening in other places, we like to be able to cover it. When we had a lot of listeners in an island nation in the Pacific talking about the need to address the issue and their history of cargo cults, which I have to admit I hadn't heard of up until I got a letter from someone in one of these places, then we did a show about it to really address it and to educate the world and to be a resource to people there. So if you want to let us know if there is an issue near you, around you, in your town, or people who you know who live in a certain place where they are really dealing with the growth of a particular kind of group or a particular kind of cult leader, let us know. I am very happy to say that the podcast over the last few weeks has been listened to all over the world, and there have been a lot of listeners in Norway and Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Slovenia, Estonia, and in the Czech Republic, in Italy, Iceland, and Namibia. So please be in contact. It is really wonderful to be able to feel connected worldwide to all of you and to be able to address what's on your mind and what's happening to you in your lives or the lives of your loved ones there. Today on the show, we have Christa Brown, named as one of the top 10 religion newsmakers of 2022. Today's guest has persisted for 2 decades in working to peel back the truth about clergy sex abuse and cover-ups in the nation's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. She was one of the first to go public with substantiated child molestation allegations against a Baptist minister, along with documentation that others knew, and she had consistently demanded reforms to make other kids and congregants safer. Christa is a retired attorney, a mom, a wife, and a grandma. And now she's the author of the new book, Baptistland, a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation, which weaves together Christa's vulnerable survivor story of hope amid Southern patriarchy, religious fundamentalism, and clergy abuse. Here is Christa now. It is my pleasure to have Christa Brown on the show today. So if you don't mind taking a moment to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, and then we will start to talk.
Rachel, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here with you on the podcast. I'm Christa Brown. I have been working trying to peel back the truth about clergy sex abuse and cover-ups in the country's largest Protestant denomination for some 20 years. And that is, of course, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is an evangelical faith group. I'm a retired appellate attorney. I am a mom and a grandma, and I'm happy to be here.
Very nice. Wow. Okay. So you come to this discussion well-armed as someone who has experienced it someone also who can speak from a legal perspective, and also being a mom and a grandma, where, you're going to care about protecting those you love and setting up, I think, a different future for them, right? I'm assuming that you bring that all to the table.
I do. I think the mom aspect of it has always been a very powerful motivator for me in multiple ways, both in terms of in my own story. It was when my own daughter approached the same age that I had been at the time that I was sexually abused by a Southern Baptist pastor. It was like my eyes just opened in a whole nother way. It shifted everything inside me, and I saw everything through new eyes because I knew that if anyone had ever done to my daughter what was done to me, that I would not blame my daughter and that I would be furious. And that very singular truth as a mother, which I never doubted, was what really then opened up all sorts of other things for me to see. And then, of course, I think like most moms, we love our own children, but there's also something about motherhood that makes us want to protect all children. I mean, I don't know if that's a human thing or if it's a mammalian thing. I mean, mammals protect the young. And so that also kind of motivated me in my advocacy work.
Mm. So, when I became a mom, I thought, how interesting. I'm actually able to access anger and a certain sense of protectiveness, like almost rage. If I saw a child hurting my child or even hurting another child, I was going to go running in and grab them. I've never touched a child in any way that's at all been hostile. I barely yell. So the fact that I was thinking, like, how dare you, like some kind of growl came up out of me. I thought, woo, where did that come from? Um, and so, it is a natural instinct. And sometimes you don't know it until you see it, that suddenly, oh, here it is. And what I noticed about what you said about responding to your daughter was that you would know not to blame her. That is going to be a big part of the story and the gaslighting that I want to be able to get to. And so I'm really glad you brought it up and brought it up that way. So yeah, let's come back to that. And I want to hear about you and about growing up and what that was like for you. And because I know you detail, so much in your book, but I want people to get to know you and your story as well as buying your book. So go for it. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, I grew up in Farmers Branch, Texas, which back then was a much smaller community. It's a suburb north of Dallas. Grew up in a Southern Baptist church. That was my whole life. I was a very, very good girl who wanted always and only to please God. I grew up also in what I would call a kind of high control family, which had a lot of problems. And I think, you see that kind of desire for control within a system, within the family system, then it was also kind of replicated within the church system. It was that kind of authoritarian domination, was replicated in, relationships, not only between, a pastor and a kid, a pastor and a congregant, a pastor and a whole congregation, but also in relationships between parent and child, between husband and wife, between even older sibling and younger sibling. Yeah, I grew up with kind of authoritarian domination as the norm.
Interesting. So, right. So when you said that you were a very good girl, what did that look like? I mean, I have a vision of what that might look like, but tell us how that is defined for you.
I was obedient. I sought to please in every way and never ever draw attention to myself or be any trouble. I was raised in a faith that taught that pastors held authority from God. They speak with the authority of God. So, I was raised, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. So biblical authority held enormous power. And so when I'm quoted with verses like, obey them that have the rule over you, for they watch over your soul, that's telling me I obey the pastor or I burn in hell, basically. For they watch over your soul. And I was raised in a faith group that if you don't love God and honor God, then you burn forever in a very literal hell, not some metaphorical thing. So that's, that weighs heavy when you're,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
you know,
that would do it. Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you can get worse than that. Right. Okay. So, I mean, so much of these things that we talk about are about, I think, behavior modification, behavior management. Instilling fear in people is really a very successful tool for behavior modification. But I think already what you're saying is that within your nature, you had this need to please and wanted to be the good kid. And then you were saying that that was also a value within your family, but it seems like that was a mixed bag. So, how did that play out in your family?
Well, in my family, I think it set me up, being constantly indoctrinated in this desire to please and to think that there's something wrong with me if I question anything. I think all of that is kind of the setup for makes you more vulnerable, at least, to abuse, a more easy target. And certainly I was. And really, of course, none of that desire to please in the end game really worked out very well for me.
Okay. Okay. Right. There are a lot of people I talk to in my private practice and also here on the podcast who will talk about how they were in these kinds of churches. All the kids needed to be like ducklings, just kind of right in a line behind the parents and all dressed, perfectly and behaving perfectly and sitting up straight and never yawning, never just being obedient. And how there were a lot of positive kudos you would get from the community around you for that. But inside those children, they weren't feeling so great. I mean, they liked getting the positive reinforcement from the people outside, but it also meant really being conditioned to behave that way and really being afraid of, doing anything that would make their family look imperfect. And was that part of it for your family too?
Well, sure. We went to church and we were trained to sit very, very still in the pew. And of course, if we didn't, like many evangelical families, we would be spanked immediately. So there was always that physical punishment too, in addition to the threat of godly and eternal punishment. And I laugh about that, but as a kid, I really believed in that godly, eternal, burning forever possibility of punishment. And so that did carry weight. The desire to put up that good image, that good, happy family, perfect family image, was so powerful that even then, there was a time when I called the police on my father, and the police came to the house, and the first thing they did was ask what church we went to. And so then they called the pastor of the church, and the pastor came out and sat and talked with us. And rather than being worried or concerned about the violence that had happened in my house, his concern was, what will the community think? What kind of a witness will this present to the community if they know that a good Christian family like yours had something like this happen.
My goodness. Okay. So you called the police on your father, and I want to find out what led up to that, of course. But the police then ask what church you belong to, and they call the pastor. That is disturbing. And I wonder if in that moment when the police don't do something to protect, but instead contact another authority, if in that moment children feel kind of hopeless, or if they feel like someone else is going to be involved in some way that might work out well or might not. I'm just curious what your reaction to that was.
As a kid, I was just incredibly confused and had just, witnessed my father with one of my sisters in a chokehold and had ran to the phone, which was something I can't even believe I did, but I did. But even as a kid, it didn't, I had no idea what would happen when the police came. So I didn't think anything of it when the police then wanted the pastor to come. But then even as a kid, having just witnessed this, and I'm listening to my pastor talk about what will people think and how that will affect the witness of Christ and the witness of the church, even then I knew there was something really wrong about that, or at least very strange about that. And yet, he was my pastor, which again, that carried a lot of weight. And so he told us to never talk about it with anyone else. So that's what I took to heart.
So the experience of seeing your father doing that to your sister, of course, is very upsetting, very disturbing. And the fact that you knew what to do and you did it says a lot about you, because there are some kids, and rightfully so, who would get very panicked into immobility in that moment. But you, and maybe this is also part of your nature, you thought, what needs to be done about this? And I think that's great that you did that. I think that says something about who you are.
Maybe so. At the time, I just didn't know what else to do. That scene of my father with my oldest sister in a chokehold and my mother trying to pull him off, and one of my other sisters sort of cowering in a corner. It was the only possibility. What else could I have done? And yet, I ran to the phone that was in my parents' bedroom, which of course we weren't allowed to use. That was the phone that I could reach, because the other phone I would have had to run past them. So yeah, I was that was an act of disobedience.
Was that something that did happen sometimes, that there was this kind of violence in the home?
That was an escalation. But yes, my father, in hindsight, of course, what I know is that he had severe PTSD from his own childhood, from his service in World War II. And back then, we didn't even have an acronym. We didn't know what was them. That's just how he was. But yes, he did have explosive rages.
Okay, which is very scary.
But also, strangely, it was all I knew in the family. That was also sort of normal.
Mm-hmm. Right. And sometimes being a good kid, following all the rules, is a way to keep yourself safe or safer,
Right. Always the hope, I think, that if only I'm perfect enough, somehow we can contain all this chaos, which of course never worked.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's not going to work. There is kind of some magical thinking in it and hopeful, wishful thinking in it. If it were related to how people were behaving in the household solely, I could imagine it working maybe a little bit better. But if it came from childhood issues and from wartime, then there were going to be other triggers that he was going to be affected by, having sometimes nothing to do with what was happening really immediately around him. So it probably didn't always make sense.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It did not.
Right. Yeah. It's hard when there isn't that kind of cause and effect, and then you can't master the system.
No, as a kid, I can remember, and of course, this is kind of lunacy too on my part, but as a kid, I can remember wishing that my father were a drinker, that he drank alcohol, because I thought that would make sense of it. That then I could have some explanation for why sometimes he had this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde persona. Um, but of course, he was a good Baptist and he didn't drink, which is probably all for the best, all things considered. And yet that's kind of the desperate desire for some explanation that I would even wish for that.
Oh, yeah. Our brain wants to have things make sense, and we want to see the causal relationship. And then there are predictors. Then he's been drinking, so we know to stay away. And, or if he yells, it's not because of us, it's because of the alcohol. It answers questions. Yeah. Wow. So interesting that you were wishing that. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So, right. Okay. So, growing up, there was a lot of intensity, but it sounds like a lot of fear that you were given to things you needed to worry about in this life and the next life. How did that impact you growing up? All the fear.
Fear was what was normal. I didn't even realize how fearful I was. It was the air I breathed, the fishbowl I lived in. I mean, large parts of evangelical theology are kind of fear based, so that was just a part of it. I mean, the God, the God that I was raised to believe in was a God that would flood the whole earth and kill all humanity except for a small group on a boat because he got pissed off. A God who would turn a woman to a pillar of stone just because she did nothing more than look backwards. A God who would instruct a father to put his son on an altar and kill him as a sacrifice. These were the stories I grew up with, and grew up with thinking about them literally. So those were fearful things, but they were also the boundaries of my faith, the box of my faith, the framework of my faith.
Okay. Okay. Yes. I know one time one of my kids where they went to Jewish day school growing up, and one of the rabbis said to my youngest at the time, "What do you think about this story? What do you think about God?" And it was the Noah and the flood story. And my daughter said, "I think," because also I was already a therapist. And my daughter said, "I think God has anger management issues."
Yes. And she sees that.
She was like
And she
7.
has her own assessment of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And she said it so innocently, like, "I think he needs some help with that."
Yeah.
It's really, really cute. And not off. Okay. So, right. So let's though talk about you and what happened to you and why, at you when your daughter turned the same age or same age as close by, you suddenly had this moment. So things happened to you during formative years that left you really with this with an impact. So let's talk about that. And I also know as you're talking, and the reason that you're talking about this and writing about it is because it didn't just happen to you, and it's happening in large numbers. And I would love to also get a sense of the size of the problem along with hearing your story. So wherever you want to start that, go ahead.
Well, I was, as a teen, sexually abused by a pastor, a Southern Baptist pastor in my church. It went on for months, 7, 8 months. It was very severe. I look back and I don't know how I could have done anything other than what I did, because I tried to understand how this could possibly be right. But of course, faith was so weaponized against me. Lean not unto thine own understanding. That's a Bible verse for those who don't know. Um, and again and again and again, scripture, holy Bible verses were twisted to control me. Were twisted into a weapon, and they made for a more powerful weapon than any knife. If I had a knife held to me, I would have at least had the instinct to run. But I had no instinct to run from what I perceived then as the Word of God. I had always known it only as that. And then toward the end, he became even more controlling. And, he told me that I was a temptress who had harbored Satan. He made me kneel forever while he purported to cast Satan from me. People often wonder, well, why don't kids speak out? But why in the world would I? Why would I want to tell anyone in that community of people that I had harbored Satan? That was just terrifying for me. Eventually, I did break down at a piano lesson. The music minister of the church was my piano teacher, mainly because I was afraid I was going to hell. After this business of saying that I harbored Satan, I was just terrified. And I wanted to know if I would go to hell. And I broke down at a piano lesson and I told the music minister. He told me to never speak of it again. Years later, I learned that actually he had already known, because the pastor himself had talked about it with the music minister. He had been afraid that someone in the congregation had seen him with me. And the music minister had done absolutely nothing and allowed the abuse to escalate even more and to continue.
Just that idea that you brought it on, that there is something inherently evil, wrong about you, and that you just being is tempting. And that is a highly confusing, gaslighting message that can be very debilitating about you feeling confident or comfortable in your own skin.
Right, exactly. And yet we know now, in more recent years, that this has happened to hundreds and hundreds of kids within the Southern Baptist Convention and within other faith groups too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. And so with the Southern Baptist Convention in particular, are there numbers? I mean, it's always hard. You don't get exact numbers, but just a sense of percentages, just so we know the size of the issue here.
Well, unlike the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist Convention doesn't keep records on its own pastors who have been credibly accused. So it makes it much harder to get a good sense of the numbers. Wind up seeing are things that are reported in the media, and those tend to be criminal convictions, pastors who have been criminally convicted of sexual abuse. By and large, that's what winds up getting reported. And of course, all experts recognize that criminal convictions are the very tip of the iceberg. Nevertheless, there was also some insurance data gathered by the Associated Press, which basically showed that Protestants, including Southern Baptists, have every bit as big of a problem of child sex abuse as the Catholics do. So, anyone who thinks that it's a Catholic problem, no, it's every bit as much a problem in evangelical faith groups. And they lack, if anything, they're about 20 years behind where the Catholics are, in that they lack structures to respond when allegations arise.
Wow. Right. Right. I think about now the systems that are in place in society at large, although they're not always utilized within Bible-based groups, but just that, for example, your piano teacher would have been a mandated reporter. And mean, clergy, also other clergy would have been, it is to interfere with this whole system of collusion and silence and really letting things happen. And I'm sure then when you were just told, when you finally came forward with the story and were just told to keep it to yourself, what happened then? And what happened emotionally for you? But then what happened later?
Well, as a kid, when I told the music minister, then not long after that, the pastor did move on to another church. It was a bigger church. He himself told me he would have a higher salary. He became a very prominent children's minister within the Southern Baptist Convention, worked for really prominent churches. His career prospered. I was pretty much left to deal with it on my own, and I kind of just went completely silent about it then until many years later as an adult, when I brought it forward again, naively assuming that people would be better educated now and that people would want to help me. But of course, I was very wrong about that because they did not. The church immediately took a scorched earth tactic of threatening to sue me if I talked about it. There had been no wisdom gained in the intervening years, nor any care for me.
Nor any care for you. So let's talk about that. So, what impact, if you don't mind sharing, what impact did those experiences at the hands of the pastor have on you? What did you notice if there were changes within you that were not addressed, that you didn't get help with?
Well, I think child sex abuse, particularly when it's repetitive and prolonged over an extended period of time, and particularly without any support in the community or from anyone, it does have an enormous impact. I didn't realize how it was impacting me, but, it eats away at you inside. In hindsight now, and after much, much, much counseling, I see that long stretches of depression. I had a suicide attempt. I see and believe that all of that was related. Difficulties with relationships, inability to trust, kind of a tendency to be isolated. I think all of that had a powerful impact that derives in very significant part from that. And that's typical with prolonged child sex abuse.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think about, and it's a term that I've used in other contexts, but I think about all the people who have endured this and who were not given an opportunity to get help with it, to be able to talk about it, to be able to get support, to know that they could then be ensured any modicum of safety or protection in the future, and that they are the kind of spiritually walking wounded, while the leaders continue on and even, get a raise and, a better job. And the feelings of betrayal that can be woven into that scenario too, that someone gets elevated while someone else is sort of falling into darkness because of them, I'm sure is very difficult.
Yes, absolutely. Massive betrayal. And I think, like many, I feel that sense. I mean, people look at the horror of child sex abuse, particularly committed by a clergy person in the name of God, in the house of God, with words of God, and they're horrified. And it is horrifying and extremely damaging. But I and many, many others who have actually lived through that will tell you that what did even more harm was the response of the faith community when we tried to bring that forward. Because it is one thing to try to come to terms with and reckon with the reality of an individual who did something truly terrible to you. But it is another thing to try to come to terms with the reality of a whole faith group of dozens and dozens of people, of your entire community, of your entire faith group, of everything you ever believed in, that turns its back on you. And that is a pretty massive betrayal.
Right. Oh, it's huge. Really is huge. And then you can wonder who cares about this? Does anyone? Does anyone care? And I wonder if you had the experience of having anybody care.
Certainly no one within the faith community. Certainly not when I was a kid and not when I was trying to bring all this forward. No one. And to the extent that there were some who talked as though they cared, who said their platitudes and nice words, the reality that is in my mind that was just more manipulation, more efforts to try to silence me. I have been very fortunate as an adult to have the full support of my husband, and that has been, and he's a very steady kind of guy, very even keeled, and that's been enormously helpful for me.
I'm sure. I'm sure that is really, really good. I had an experience, and I want to come back to you kind of leaving, what that was like for you to leave and who you left behind, really, when you left the whole system. I was speaking at a national social work conference, and it was meeting in the South, and it's an area I hadn't been in before, but I don't know if that even needs to be part of the story or if it's interesting or important, but the topic that I was covering was basically, why did I stay? This is for people in very unhealthy situations, relationships, etc. And that's the question that they're often asked. Well, why did you stay? And that there are many really, valid reasons. And also that what you want at the end of the day is for that to not be the question, that it isn't about why you stayed, but about why people put you in a situation where you felt like you didn't have a choice, or you felt like you would lose your kids if you left, or what, really kind of backed you into that corner, and that's where the focus should be. But there were 3 different women who at this point were social workers who came up and talked to me about having all been sexually abused by people within their churches when they were growing up or when they were young adults. And they each told me that I should have added something in my talk that they were surprised that, because at the end I said, and how do you get past that experience of knowing that you didn't act on your own behalf or really couldn't, and how to make sure to, when you get into another relationship or another workplace or another church or whatever it is, these are the things to watch out for. And so they all wanted to talk to me about the part where I was talking about healing and getting past it, and that I didn't mention forgiveness. And I thought it wouldn't have occurred to me, actually. It wasn't part of what I was thinking about how you get past it. But for each of them, they said that was really important and that that's helped them move on. And they all talked about how they were abused by someone within their church. They then went to their family or they went to someone else within the church and were told by them that they needed to forgive, and that was the way to be able to move on. And finally, after the 3rd story, I said to this woman who, unfortunately for her, was getting the accumulation of me not wanting to ask the other women that I didn't ask them. And I think it probably came out in a more forceful way because it was cumulative. I just said, what happened to the pastor? But okay, you can forgive if that helps you, but what happened to the pastor? And she looked at me blankly. She said, honey, what do you mean? And I thought, wow, that's not even part of the story, because it's not part of the story. It's for their experience. I think they didn't expect it, that he would be fired or something would happen to them or whatever else. Nothing. Why are you even bringing it up? And it just hits me as people tell these stories, like your story. What are you talking about?
Right. Among survivors I talk to, many of us refer to forgiveness as the F word, precisely because we feel that it has been weaponized so much to try to continue to silence us. So it's just one more way of using faith as a way to control us. And of course, the reality is there is no amount of forgiveness that's going to make others any safer. That's not going to take care of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. I think that with forgiveness, sure, if you're steeped in that anger and it's eating away at you, and it would help for you to forgive, fine, then do it for yourself. But I think it should be merit based. And if you see someone really is understanding what they did and they're apologizing and they also are not going to be doing it again and you notice they're not doing it again, okay, fine. There are a lot of things, I think a lot of action steps that need to take place on the other person's part. But if the focus is just still on the victim for needing to do yet something else, it's really, yeah, it's so unfair. So the idea of being a temptress, tell me about that and tell me about how that gets woven into the psyche for women and maybe even for girls and maybe even for boys as well. In fact, I would assume it if it's always blaming the victim. So tell me about how that impacted you and how you've noticed that impacts others.
Well, of course, it's another way of controlling, because if I'm the temptress and I'm the one who harbored Satan and I'm the one who was a Jezebel and who tempted a godly man, one of God's own anointed, then the problem is with me. And now I need to figure out how to do something about myself. It is just one more control tactic. And you're right, too. And I'm so glad you brought up that boys, of course, are also victims. All children are. All children can be vulnerable. I have known many, many survivors who were sexually abused as boys by Southern Baptist pastors. And they, too, get blamed in ways it's endless. It is always blame the victim because the alternative is blaming this man of God. And I think faith is so wrapped up in people's self identities that our narratives as survivors on what was done to us in this faith, these are very dissonant narratives that people do not want to hear and will do almost anything to push aside.
Right. Right. Okay. And so I want to be able to find out about when you left, how old you were, and what the decision was like for you, because usually it's a long time in coming. So I'm just curious about that process and what you did after.
For me, it wasn't really a conscious decision to leave because for decades, I didn't really recognize that what had been done to me was abuse. Somewhere lodged in my mind, I still blamed myself and as the girl who had tempted the man of God. But I was so deeply uncomfortable in any faith-based environment, hearing all that stuff, all the accoutrements of faith, the hymns, the verses, the prayers. For me, those felt like triggers to run, you know, flee from this because great harm lies here. I think I felt all that on an instinctive level. And so basically, once I left high school, I did not join with a faith community. I certainly visited sometimes, tried, but could never feel comfortable again.
Okay. All right. And then tell me about you moving into your life as it is now, getting married, becoming a mom and a grandma.
Well, that's the best part, of course.
Yeah.
Things do get better.
Uh-huh.
You know, the the early years with my husband were difficult years. That was in significant part because I had psychological issues. But I've been very fortunate that, I was able to, particularly as I got a little older and quite a bit older, but I did get some really good counseling, really good therapy. And I feel like I was fortunate for that. Many don't. But I was able to build a life for myself that was apart from the control of the environment I grew up in. And I think that was really important.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it is very, very important. And I think also it informs our decisions about who we want to have in our life, what kind of personality we need for them to have. I mean, you just talked about your husband being very even after describing a dad who raged, and how healing that is to have someone who you then can live with who has a predictable nature. It's really nice to not know what you're walking into and what you're coming home to.
Yeah, that kind of stability is an enormous help. There's something else I wanted to say. These things that happened to me happened within the Southern Baptist Convention, and that have happened to many, many more. And that is the largest Protestant faith group in the country. And I think precisely because it is so big, people are prone to look at it as being mainstream. But these things are happening, they're very high control, and in my view, often very extreme. And it is the very fact that they're so big that people tend to dismiss what happens there. Because how could it be something fringe and extreme when it's the largest Protestant denomination in the country? And yet, I think it is. There are those elements there of very high control, and I think they're very concerning. And we see that control being manifested not only on a micro level with how individual pastors can use the faith to control their victims, but we see it also on a macro level with how the faith group itself tries to insert itself into public policy using faith.
Okay. Let's talk about this. Yes, it is true that people are given a sense of safety about a group when it has reached a certain number of members. When also people think of something being mainstream, they do think that it follows by a certain ethical, moral code. And that's not necessarily the case. You still want to do a buyer beware or spiritual buyer beware. And it's the pushback that a lot of people get when they are coming forward talking about an issue that they had in their Mormon church or with Jehovah's Witnesses or groups where people just see them around and might not know that something can happen that goes awry. But yeah, there is something that feels tried and true about the name of the group. And so, no, you wouldn't think that something is happening here. So I'm sure that you're getting, when you tell these stories, you hear a lot of, really? Like, it just seems unbelievable.
Right, right.
Right. That's very hard. It's hard to be the truth teller in these scenarios. And tell me then more about the reach that it seems to have when you're saying the power that it exerts, the micro and the macro. Tell us about that.
Well, you see the micro in my own story and in the story of so many other survivors for whom faith has been weaponized for purposes of child rape, child molestation, and also, of course, adult congregants too are abused by their pastors. On the macro level, I think we see often evangelical theology being brought into the service of authoritarianism, for control and domination, for keeping people in their little narrow boxes. I think that's of real concern nowadays. I mean, it's part of what we see with Christian nationalism, is that the merging of faith with public policy and the attempting to control people through faith and to legitimize that through the use of faith symbolism, I think is all very concerning. It all reckons back to, for me at least, to being a kid and marching into vacation Bible school singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers," which as a kid I would sing at the top of my lungs, and believing wholeheartedly that I was in the service of some much greater good, the service of God, the service of the kingdom of God, and bringing that kingdom here to earth. And I think we see in state houses across the country book bannings, efforts to denounce in vitro fertilization technologies and control people's medical decisions about how they form their families. I think we see a lot of that, of religion being brought to bear to influence and control those kinds of decisions.
Right. Right. I was just hearing about a state in the United States. Let me see if I can.
Louisiana.
Yes. Exactly. So now the 10 Commandments need to be displayed in every public school classroom.
Yes.
Yes, public school.
What I saw was it would be elementary school, middle school, high school, and even public college classrooms.
Oh my goodness gracious. Okay.
And they even specified it has to be displayed, as I recall, on poster board no smaller than 11 by 14 or something like this.
Wow. Incredible. I mean, I know that there has been this infusion in society in a lot of different ways. I remember reading about how "In God We Trust" used to not be printed on the money, and the money in the United States, and because there are people who live all over and who listen to this show. But I think it is very troubling. I mean, of that whole phrase that I just read, the word public is the thing that really stands out to me, that this is through taxpayer dollar.
Yes, I think that we are seeing in this country now the erosion of boundaries between church and state. And I find that deeply concerning.
Right. I'm wondering what else you're seeing. I mean, with the Southern Baptist Convention, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to infuse into our, not only I think into our schools, et cetera, but also into our psyche?
Well, I think we see a lot of otherizing of people whom they are afraid of for whatever reason. But certainly we see the otherizing of LGBTQ people in ways that are hateful. We see in their just a week ago in their big annual meeting that the Southern Baptist Convention had, where they make resolutions and motions and policies, they 61.45% voted for a constitutional amendment to say that no woman could be any kind of a pastor. Now, because it required a 2/3 vote, it didn't pass, but still 61% there. That's an awfully lot who are adamant that they cannot be any kind of pastor, not even a pastor like a children's pastor, not even a pastor who works under the authority of a senior male pastor. No, a woman cannot be any kind of pastor. That's putting women there in a pretty tiny little small box. We saw them pass a resolution urging that the government should take steps to prevent IVF the use of IVF technologies, in vitro fertilization technologies, because of the personhood of embryos, IVF embryos, frozen embryos. We have seen the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary writing that women who have abortion should be prosecuted for murder. He allowed that, depending on the circumstances, they should be criminally prosecuted, but there could be some variation between whether that would be for manslaughter or for murder. Nevertheless, he's talking about prosecuting women. And I hear these things, and to me, this sounds like efforts to move our society towards something more akin to a theocracy, which I don't want to see. I don't want my grandchildren to see that. So, yes, I'm very concerned about the influence of this faith group.
And so the men who got the women pregnant, nothing.
Nothing is said of them, no.
No, crickets, as they say, right? Okay, wow, right. And just the idea of criminalizing any of it, I mean, if we even just look at it practically with the prison system already being overrun, and not rehabilitative as it should be in a lot of respects, and filled with people who also are often marginalized already. But to be able to have it be filled with women because of getting pregnant as though they did it to themselves. Hello? That says a lot about how backward it is and how steeped in just not understanding, really, I think, very much of anything, but that it really is just based on fear, control. What do you think it's about?
I do think it's about fear and control. I think it is about maintaining status quo power. It's a very patriarchal system. This is a system that they have enjoyed for a long time, and they want to preserve it. And yes, they call forth all sorts of Bible verses. Oh my gosh, these people are very good at quoting Bible verses. But what I think is that the ideology comes first, the ideology of male supremacy. And then the Bible verses are used to legitimize that.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Right. So it happens in that order, which is very telling. Yes. And then with the Bible verse, you never know if it's sort of either taken out of context or mistranslated.
Right. And in any event, they are the ones who are purporting to exercise the power to tell us what that Bible verse means.
Right. My goodness. I think I know this feels like an oversimplification, but if everyone would just relax, right? Just like, whatever. It's not like, people who are LGBTQ are, wreaking havoc and, they're not sociopaths. They're not committing the crimes. They're not doing the things. The fact also that women can't be pastors, but this man who sexually abused you can be.
Exactly.
Right.
No, and it is exactly that. We have just this past week, we have seen these arguments of, if you allow women in the pulpit, then it's a slippery slope to allowing LGBTQ people in the pulpit. And there's that fear of what? And meanwhile, what we know for sure is that they have a huge problem with their own male pastors who are sexually abusing kids and congregants, and with a whole host of others who are enabling it and covering it up and being complicit with that system. Impunity for pastors. That's the system.
Oh my goodness. What a system that should end. So it's so good to know that there are people out there like you who are telling these stories. And I'm sure it's not been easy, because you're up against, even though you're just saying this is what happens and this is what happened to me, you're up against a large organization that is powerful, that is not used to being taken to task, that is also well funded. And I wonder what it's been like for you. How has it been for you?
That part has been very, very painful, and at times scary and concerning. Less so now than it used to be, but certainly in the earlier days, I felt very much like a voice in the wilderness talking about this. And I was massively vilified, not just by isolated rogue people out there, but by some of the highest leaders, the highest spiritual authorities of the largest Protestant faith group in the country. It's a multi-billion-dollar tentacular uh, organization. And some of their highest leaders called me names, said I was an evildoer, that I was just as reprehensible as a sex criminal, that I was part of a satanic scheme, that I was demonic, that I was nothing more than an opportunist. And these are the things that were said and that made their way into the public record by the highest leaders. So when you have that kind of rhetoric coming from very high spiritual leaders, well, those words have consequences, and it has a trickle down effect, because then what happens is all sorts of other people see that and they take that as license for even more brutishness. So, of course, I've been the recipient of heaps of hate mail and all of that. That kind of stuff, that is not the damage done to me by childhood sexual abuse, or even the damage done to me by the cover up of my childhood church. That's the damage done to me by the highest leaders of this faith group who unleashed this pestilence of hate. And yes, it had an enormous impact on me.
I'm sure it did. And not that you need to mention their names, but what are the titles? I mean, when you're saying the highest leaders.
Oh, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, president of the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee, seminary president. These were very high-ranking men.
Incredible. My goodness. Right. And that moment that it was happening, I'm sure it had a very big impact on you. How do you see it now?
Sadly, I think very, very little has changed within this faith group. There's been very little meaningful change that would act toward making kids and congregants safer, or that would care for this body of survivors that they have left in the wreckage. In my view, they have gotten better at public relations work. They tend to be a lot smoother now. But in terms of meaningful change, meaningful reform, no, I don't see it at all. Which is sad. I think a kid today, someone coming forward today trying to report childhood sexual abuse committed by a pastor of the Southern Baptist Convention, would still face nearly all the same hurdles that I faced decades ago, several decades ago.
It is, yes, that is very sad. And it is, a difficult message. It can feel hopeless. I hope that it does change. And just this idea that you were supposed to stay silent and, not convey a message that was going to affect the reputation of the group when that's the message you got growing up. And now they're trying to silence you, intimidate you, really certainly keep you quiet. I think you can tell so much about the health of an organization in how it treats its truth tellers. And if there is also a system in place to receive the information and make change, and if there's a willingness to look at what needs to be different and to make it different. And until that happens, then you're right, nothing changes.
I think that's right. Nothing changes institutionally. I do think over the course of these years that a lot has changed with a lot of individuals, because as the truth gets out there, people see it, and then they feel more as if they can tell the truth of their own stories. And I think that's a very positive thing. And we also know that the membership numbers for the Southern Baptist Convention are dwindling. And so these things constitute change, even if the institution itself really never changes.
Right. And that I could see if the numbers are dwindling, that would be information that's hidden from the public. But if it is information that gets out, then the people who are making waves like you are going to be blamed for that, rather than the system itself that's making people unsafe and unprotected. But I think the same thing will happen if the system hasn't changed. Okay. Well, I'm so glad that you have come forward, and you're right. People sometimes will wait. They don't want to be the lone voice. They don't want to be the first. And when they hear someone else, when they also see someone else going through the fire, they then feel they can come forward. You become a trustworthy person to them. And so I'm sure you've heard from people who have said me too, and how important it was, right, to hear you tell what you told. And so where can people find your book or anything else that you want them to be able to check out?
Well, you can find my book, Baptistland, wherever you get your books, whether that's Barnes and Noble or Amazon. You can get it anywhere. And I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm Christa Brown 777. And I also have a Substack newsletter, which is christabrown.substack.com.
Okay. All righty. Really, really wonderful to talk to you and get to know you and to hear about all that you've done and all that you have kind of conquered and survived, and the beautiful life that you have now. And it's well-deserved and lovely to chat.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks for what you do as well, for bringing these stories out.
My pleasure. One more thing before you go. So, my goodness, Christa, you have been through quite a lot. It is really amazing to hear that someone has come through something that is so troubling and also has walked right into the fire, so to speak, by writing about it, by wanting to do something about it. There is something so powerful about a couple of the things that she talked about, and I want to be able to highlight them. You know, the idea that when she was sexually abused, the pastor said that she was a temptress who harbored Satan. Well, I hear these stories all the time, whether it is that language of it being Satan or some other language, but just that whoever turned you on and it was someone who you shouldn't be having any kind of physical relationship with, somehow tempted you and you couldn't help yourself. Even though people in that role usually are supposed to be the picture of self-control. But when it comes to this, suddenly they're not. I can't quite imagine how that would fly, how that would make sense anywhere, in any environment. I'm going to be a model to you of how you should not do a number of things. And I don't drink and I don't smoke and I don't do all the things. But in this case, I couldn't help it. So, the idea also that the person who's victimized is the person who brought it on, that is old and tired and wrong, but is so used and abused. And then it further abuses the abused, because in those environments, the people who, quote unquote, made someone sleep with them or made someone attracted to them, the siren of the religious organization, in some situations starts to believe it. They will wonder if they did do something or said something that made a person not be able to resist them. They may not be aware that they were doing anything or saying anything, because they weren't, but they will search for a time that maybe they led someone on, they did something they shouldn't, they sent out a signal that they weren't even aware of. And it causes these people who have been victimized to gaslight themselves, to look and think that there is something wrong about them, that they sent out a vibe, a message. And these poor people who just couldn't help themselves just had to attack them or had to do something to their bodies that they didn't actually want to have to do. It is so convoluted. And when people have not been raised in religious environments and they hear these stories, there is this audible eye rolling that takes place. Like, oh, come on. But within that environment, it's believed and believable, and the victim will often look inward, and the perpetrator will often look inward. What is so weak about me that I couldn't resist this temptress? It's so ingrained sometimes in both the victim and the perpetrator that it keeps there from being a clarity, sometimes in any direction, about what is right and what is wrong, and also that you are actually able to have self-control. And if you don't, that's not on the person who you're suddenly attracted to. That's on you and will remain on you. And if you want to learn to have self-control, as opposed to pointing the finger outward and blaming a person for tempting you, then learn how to have self-control. If you're involved in an organization that doesn't support you needing to find any self-control, and only the victim needs to have self-control, only the victim needs to have had more control over the messages they were sending, but the perpetrator doesn't, you want to look at the whole system as being unjust, unfair, very lopsided, and protecting people who do very bad things to innocent people. Because it's bad enough to do it, and then it's bad on top of that to blame the person you did it to. Something else she mentioned was that she wished her father had been a drinker so his rage made sense. You know, we want our world to make sense. We want to be able to say, it wasn't my dad's fault. It wasn't my fault that he screamed at us and screamed at me or may have hurt me. It was this other thing. It was some kind of drug, or it was some kind of drink. It was something that makes me feel better to think about because then he couldn't help it. We don't want to know that the people who love us can't help hurting us. We want to be able to blame something else. We want something to be standing squarely between us and our loved ones who are raging at us. So we can say, oh, it's not that he doesn't care about me, not that he doesn't love me. It's this other thing that's gotten a hold of his whole system so that he just doesn't have the same inhibition. He doesn't have the same control. So much of what Christa talked about was, as I saw it, through a child's eyes, trying to make sense of things. How do we define this? How do we understand this? What does this mean about me? What does this mean about the world that I'm going to be growing up in? And how do I keep myself safe if the people around me are reminding me day after day that the world is not a safe place? So thank you to Christa for sharing her story and for doing what she can to educate people so that the world does become a safer place. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.